Divine Principle, Part 2, the Principle of Restoration, Chapter 5, the Period of Preparation for the Second Advent of the Messiah, Part 4, the World Wars, and the Second World War, 4.3. A summary of the providence in the Second World War. The spiritual origin of modern democracy lies in the people striving to realize the values of the Abel-type view of life. Democracy follows the internal and external aspirations of the original human nature, and will certainly develop in the direction of God's ideal world. Fascism, on the other hand, constrains people from following the aspirations of their original nature. In the Second World War, democracy, while standing upon the formation stage victory attained in the First World War, defeated fascism and secured victory at the growth stage. The nature of fascism. When economic depression overwhelmed the world in the 1930s, some nations tried to break out of it by adopting fascism. This was the road taken by Germany, Japan, and Italy, which felt isolated and beset by adversity. What then is fascism? Fascism denies the fundamental values of modern democracy, including respect for the individual and his basic rights, freedoms of speech, the press, association, and the parliamentary system. Race or nationality is the ultimate value, to be upheld by a strong nation-state. Individuals and institutions exist only for the benefit of the state. Under fascism, individuals cannot claim freedom as their inviolable right. They are to sacrifice their freedom in their duty to serve the state. The guiding political principle of fascism holds that all power and authority should be entrusted in one supreme leader, rather than distributed among the people. The personal will of the leader dictates the governing ideology for the entire nation. Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and the leaders of Japan's militaristic government were dictators of the fascist type. The nations on God's side and the nations on Satan's side in the Second World War. In the Second World War, an alliance of the democratic nations of the United States, Great Britain, and France led the nations on God's side. Satan's side was the alliance of the fascist nations of Germany, Japan, and Italy. What determined that the former stood on God's side and the latter on Satan's side? The Allies stood on God's side because their political systems were democracies. The political system for the final stage in the providence of restoration, founded upon the Abel-type view of life. The Axis powers, on the other hand, stood on Satan's side because they upheld fascism, which was anti-democratic and stemmed from the Cain-type view of life. Moreover, the Allies and the Axis powers were separated into God's side and Satan's side because the former nations supported Christianity while the latter opposed and persecuted Christianity. Germany, the leader of the Axis powers, deprived people of their basic freedoms, and its ideological oppression denied them their religious freedom. Furthermore, Hitler massacred 6 million Jews. After concluding a concordat with the Pope, Hitler attempted to subordinate the churches under the control of cooperative bishops while corrupting Christianity into a nationalistic neo-paganism based on primitive Germanic religion. In protest, some Protestants and Catholics put up a bitter resistance. Japanese militarists during the Second World War forced every church in Korea to install a kamidana, an altar for the Japanese Shinto gods, and compelled Korean Christians to worship at Shinto shrines. Those Christians who did not comply were imprisoned or killed. Korean Christians who fled to Manchuria in search of religious freedom were brutally massacred. These measures against Korean Christianity were intensified toward the end of the war. Italy supported Germany's cause as one of the Axis powers. Against the general thrust of God's providence, Mussolini promoted Catholicism as a state religion with a selfish intention to use it for unifying the people under his fascist regime. On these grounds, Germany, Japan, and Italy during the war may be classified as the nations on Satan's side. The providential roles of the three nations on God's side and Satan's side. One purpose behind the Second World War was to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition at the growth stage to restore God's three great blessings, as was meant to occur at the time of Jesus. In the beginning, it was due to the fall of Adam, Eve, and the archangel that God's three great blessings were not realized. Therefore, in the restoration of the three blessings, there necessarily have to be three actors taking these respective roles. Thus, God spiritually restored the three blessings in the providence of spiritual salvation through the joint efforts of the resurrected Jesus as the second Adam, and the Holy Spirit representing Eve, and angels. Accordingly, during the Second World War, the three nations on God's side represented Adam, Eve, and the archangel, led the fight against the three nations on Satan's side, which also represented Adam, Eve, and the archangel. The victory of the nations on God's side would make a growth stage indemnity condition for the restoration of the three great blessings. Satan, who was aware of this providence, took the lead by mustering the three nations representing Adam, Eve, and the archangel on his side, and had them attack the three nations on God's side. The United States, as a masculine type of nation, represented Adam on God's side. Great Britain, as a feminine type of nation, represented Eve on God's side. France, as a mixed type of nation, represented the archangel on God's side. On Satan's side, Germany, as a masculine type of nation, represented Adam. Japan, as a feminine type of nation, represented Eve. And Italy, as a mixed type of nation, represented the archangel. In the First World War, the United States, Great Britain, and France had represented the formation stage, these three positions on God's side, while Germany, Austria, and Turkey took these positions on Satan's side. The Soviet Union, as a nation on Satan's side, participated in the Second World War on God's side. Well, how is that possible? When a medieval society could not fulfill its providential purpose, it became a hindrance to both God's side and Satan's side, which then divided and began developing along paths leading to the maturation of the democratic world and the communist world. The Cain-type and Abel-type views of life worked in tandem to break down medieval feudal society, and later absolute monarchy and imperialism. Just as God's providence progresses while riding on the currents of its time, Satan's effort to build an unprincipled imitation of the ideal world is also bound to the currents of its time. When the prevailing social order obstructs the formation of new societies, including those furthering Satan's goals, Satan joins in the fight to destroy it. In a similar fashion, fascism had become an obstacle to both Satan's side and God's side, because the providence of restoration through indemnity required that God temporarily permit Satan's side to form the communist world. The Soviet Union in the Second World War was allowed to join forces with the nations on God's side to destroy fascism, in order that it might quickly build up its communist state. Nevertheless, as soon as the Second World War was over, the communist world and the democratic world separated like oil and water. The providential causes behind the Second World War. The internal providential causes behind the Second World War were as follows. First, the war broke out to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition at the growth stage to restore God's three great blessings. The ideal world where God's three blessings are fulfilled, which could not be realized by Adam due to the fall, was to have been realized by Jesus, whom God sent as the second Adam. Yet this ideal was realized only spiritually because Jesus died on the cross. Yet this ideal was realized, since Satan tries to realize in advance a defective imitation of the ideal world, at the consummation of history, there will surely emerge an unprincipled world which has realized defectively the imitation of the ideal world, the outward form of the three great blessings, at the growth stage, under the leadership of the satanic antitype of Jesus. God's side must prevail over this world and thereby fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition at the growth stage required for the restoration of the ideal world, where the three great blessings are fully realized, centering on God. Hitler was a satanic type of antitype of Jesus. Though his will was totally contrary to Jesus, certain aspects of Hitler's life mimicked, in a perverted manner, some of the events in Jesus' life. His grandiose vision, his single life, and the disappearance of his corpse are examples. Hitler was also the satanic antitype of perfected Adam at the growth stage. He made a travesty of the blessing of the multiplication of children by advocating the purity of the Germanic people as the master race, and mimicked the blessing of dominion over the creation by his policy of world conquest. In this manner, Hitler realized an unprincipled world with a satanic form of the three blessings, fulfilled at the growth stage. By prevailing in the Second World War, God's side was to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition at the growth stage to restore the ideal world of God's three blessings. The second providential cause behind the war was to have the people on God's side overcome Jesus' second temptation on the world level. In light of the meaning of Jesus' three temptations, we can recognize that God's side had to prevail in the Second World War to fulfill the indemnity condition to restore worldwide God's second blessing. As Jesus laid the foundation for the restoration of children by overcoming the second temptation in the wilderness, God's side was to lay the worldwide growth stage foundation for democracy by triumphing in the Second World War. The third providential cause behind the war was to lay the growth stage foundation for the restoration of God's sovereignty. By the victory of God's side in the First World War, the democratic world had secured its formation stage foundation. Working to build the Cain-type world, Satan's side also benefited from the collapse of Tsarist absolutism during the First World War and laid the formation stage foundation for the communist world. During the Second World War, the communist world and the democratic world built their separate growth stage foundations before parting company at the conclusion of the war. Building the growth stage foundation for the democratic world restored the growth stage foundation of God's sovereignty. The providential results of the Second World War. The victory of God's side in the Second World War fulfilled the growth stage indemnity condition to restore God's three great blessings worldwide. Having the significance of overcoming Jesus' second temptation on the world level, the victory fulfilled the indemnity condition to restore God's second blessing worldwide. Finally, by laying the growth stage foundation for the democratic world, it established the growth stage foundation to restore God's sovereignty. While Hitler was the antitype of Jesus on Satan's side, Stalin was the antitype of the second advent of Christ on Satan's side. The fact that Hitler and his nation were destroyed while Stalin and his foundation of worldwide communism grew strong indicated that the time for building the spiritual kingdom under the leadership of the resurrected Jesus had passed, and the age for building a new heaven and new earth under the leadership of Christ at the second advent had begun. At the conclusion of the Second World War, the growth stage of the dispensation of the second advent commenced. Many Christians began receiving revelations about the return of Jesus, and God's spiritual works began occurring throughout the world. Since then, the established churches have become increasingly confused, divided, and secularized. They have been gradually losing the heart of their spiritual life. These are phenomena of the last days occurring on account of God's final providence to unify all religions through the new ultimate expression of the truth. The Third World War. Is a Third World War inevitable? We know that because God gave the first human ancestors the blessing to rule the universe, when Satan works through fallen people to create an unprincipled imitation of the world where this blessing is fulfilled, God has to allow it. On the heels of Satan, God conducts his providence to claim back Satan's world and its fruits. At the consummation of human history, Satan's side and God's side will strive until they each attain sovereignty over a world. This is why the democratic world and the communist world stand confronting each other. Consequently, it became inevitable that there be world wars, first to divide and then to unify these two worlds. The First and Second World Wars had the providential purpose of dividing the globe into the communist world and the democratic world. Afterward, yet another war must take place to bring about their unification. This conflict is the Third World War. It's inevitable that the Third World War take place. However, there are two possible ways it may be fought. One way to bring Satan's side to surrender is through armed conflict. However, at the conclusion of the conflict, there should come an ideal world in which all humanity is to rejoice together. This can never be built merely by defeating enemies in battle. Afterward, they must be brought to submission internally, that everyone may be reconciled and rejoice sincerely from the bottom of their hearts. To accomplish this, there must come a perfect ideology which can satisfy the desires of the original nature of all people. The other way this war may be fought is as a wholly internal, ideological conflict, without the outbreak of armed hostilities to bring Satan's world to submission and unification in a short time. People are rational beings. Therefore, a perfect unified world can be established only when people submit to one another and participate in unification through a profound reawakening. By which of these two ways will the Third World War actually be fought? It depends upon success or failure in carrying out the human portion of responsibility. From where will the ideology essential to the resolution of this conflict and the establishment of a new world come? It surely cannot come out of the communist world, rooted in the Kane-type view of life, since the Kane-type view of life opposes the internal aspirations of the original human nature. Rather, this ideology must arise out of the democratic world, which is rooted in the Abel-type view of life. Nonetheless, it's a fact of history that no conventional ideology among those prevailing in the democratic world can effectively defeat the communist ideology. Therefore, a hitherto unknown ideology will emerge from within the democratic world. For the new ideology to be born, there must arise a new expression of the truth. This new truth is the essence of the Abel-type view of life and the core of democracy. As has been the case in the past, when the new expression of truth appears, it may contradict the old expressions of truth, in which many people have believed. Hence, even the democratic world will be divided into two camps, which, like Cain and Abel, will be pitted against each other. When the new truth secures a victorious foundation in the democratic world and then conquers the communist ideology, the unification of the world will be achieved based on the one truth. Satan knew God's plan to unify the world through the one truth and presented a false imitation of the truth in order to unify humanity centered on himself. This false truth is dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism denies the existence of any spiritual reality, setting up an explanation of the universe based on a wholly materialistic logic. In denying the existence of God, it also denies the existence of Satan. Thus, in promoting dialectical materialism, Satan was effectively denying his own reality, even risking his own demise. Satan understood that what would unfold at the close of human history and knew well that he would surely perish. Accepting that this is not the time to be worshipped, he rose in a monstrous denial of God, even at the sacrifice of himself. This is the spiritual root of dialectical materialism. As long as the democratic world lacks the truth which can overturn this evil doctrine, it will always be vulnerable and on the defensive. For this reason, someone on God's side must proclaim the perfect truth. Summary of the providence in the Third World War. The Third World War is the final conflict in the providence of restoration. Through this war, God intends that the democratic world bring the communist world to submission and build the ideal world. Leading up to the First World War, the nations on God's side had expanded their political and economic dominion by claiming colonies throughout the world to be used by God for his providence. At the conclusion of the war, these nations laid the worldwide formation stage foundation for democracy. Through the Second World War, they laid the worldwide growth stage foundation for democracy, thereby firmly consolidating the democratic world. During the Third World War, God's side is to found the perfect Abel-type view of life based on the new truth and complete the worldwide completion stage foundation for democracy. God's side is then to guide all of humanity into one unified world. In summary, the Third World War is the last great war at the close of history. When God's side restores horizontally through indemnity all that was lost to Satan throughout the three stages of the prolonged providence. The providential causes behind the Third World War. As was explained above, whether the Third World War is waged by forces of arms or as an ideological conflict depends upon the responsibility of the people who are serving the providence of God. Regardless, it's inescapable that this worldwide conflict take place. What are the internal, providential causes behind the Third World War? First, the war has to take place to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition at the completion stage to restore God's three great blessings. When Jesus could accomplish the providence of restoration only spiritually, due to the disbelief of the people, it became necessary that he return and restore the world of God's ideal, both spiritually and physically. Yet, since Satan realizes in advance the defective form of God's ideal, at the consummation of history, there will emerge an unprincipled world with a pretense of having restored the three great blessings, under the leadership of a satanic antitype of Christ at the Second Advent. By prevailing over the satanic world, God's side is responsible to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition at the completion stage to restore the ideal world in which the three great blessings are fulfilled, centering on God. Stalin was the satanic antitype of Christ at the Second Advent. He was idolized as a perfect human being. By advocating the solidarity of farmers and workers in opposition to the democratic world, he mimicked the blessing of the multiplication of children. And by his policy of worldwide communist dominion, he achieved the outward semblance of the blessing of dominion over the creation. Stalin thus created a vast communist world which realized effectively the outward form of the three great blessings. We must understand that the communist world is the unprincipled and flawed imitation of the world of God's ideal, which will be characterized by interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values founded in God. Second, the Third World War has to take place to have the people on God's side overcome Jesus' third temptation on the world level. In light of the meaning of Jesus' three temptations, we recognize that God's side must prevail in the Third World War to fulfill the indemnity condition to restore worldwide God's third blessing. As Jesus established the foundation to restore dominion over the creation by overcoming the third temptation in the wilderness, God's side must win in the Third World War to restore human beings' dominion over the entire universe. The providential results of the Third World War. Third, the Third World War has to take place to lay the completion stage foundation for the restoration of God's sovereignty. God's side must be victorious in the war to destroy the communist world and return all sovereignty to God. Then the ideal world will be established based upon the principles of heaven and earth. The providential results of the Third World War. Long ago, God intended to conclude his providence of restoration in Adam's family by working through Cain and Abel. Instead, Cain murdered Abel, commencing the sinful history of humanity. God began the dispensation of dividing good and evil to restore the failure of Adam's family on the individual level and developed it through the levels of the family, clan, society, nation, and the time has come when God conducts this dispensation on the world level. God intends to restore through indemnity the entire providence, which was prolonged to the third stage, by winning victory in the three world wars, which belong to the final chapter of providential history. In the beginning, the first human ancestors lost their connection of heart to God when they fell prey to the tempting words of Satan. Through the internal spiritual fall and the external physical fall, they inherited the lineage of Satan. Therefore, the providence of restoration can be completed only after fallen people restore their heart toward God through God's life-giving word, are saved both spiritually and physically, and inherit God's lineage. The victories of God's side in the three world wars will fully restore through indemnity all these aspects of the providence of restoration. They will make possible the realization of God's ideal world, for which God has labored with unremitting tears over the centuries of human misery since the fall.